I'd been working underwater welding for 5 years now, and I thought I knew all the tricks the Gulf of Mexico could throw at me. The oil rigs scattered across these waters had become my second home, and Platform 7 was just another job site where I'd spend my days fixing whatever the ocean had decided to break. The morning briefing had been routine enough. Robert Hayes, my supervisor, handed me the work order with his usual no-nonsense expression. "Support beam on the northeast leg," he said, checking his clipboard. "Stress fracture about 120 feet down. Should be a straightforward repair." I nodded and started suiting up. 5 years of this work had taught me to respect the water, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The Gulf had moods, sometimes calm as glass, other times angry enough to toss a platform around like a toy. Today felt somewhere in between, with swells that rocked the deck just enough to remind you where you were. Getting into my diving gear was second nature by now. Wetsuit first, then the weight belt, then the tank harness. I checked my regulator twice, tested my emergency ascent system, and made sure my welding equipment was properly sealed. The underwater torch was my lifeline down there. Without it, I was just another guy holding his breath in the dark. "Radio check," I said into my comm system as I walked to the platform edge. "Copy that, Marcus," came Robert's voice through the speaker. "Water temps 72 degrees, visibility about 30 feet. Take your time down there." I gave him a thumbs up and stepped backward off the platform. The water hit me with that familiar shock of cold, even through the wetsuit. I let myself sink for a moment, equalizing the pressure in my ears as the surface disappeared above me. The descent to 120 feet took about 4 minutes. I'd learned not to rush it. The deeper you went, the more careful you had to be about nitrogen buildup in your blood. Too much too fast, and you'd start seeing things that weren't there. Nitrogen narcosis was no joke at these depths. The platform leg came into view as I descended, a massive steel column disappearing into the murky water below. My lights cut through the gloom, illuminating the barnacles and marine growth that covered every surface down here. Fish scattered as I approached, their silver bodies flashing in my beam before vanishing into the darkness. I found the damaged support beam exactly where the work order said it would be. The stress fracture ran about 18 inches along the weld seam, probably caused by the constant flexing from wave action. Nothing I hadn't seen 100 times before. I positioned myself carefully and fired up the underwater torch. The flame burned bright blue-white in the water, creating a bubble of superheated steam around the work area. Welding underwater was tricky. You had to account for the water cooling the metal faster than normal, and the visibility dropped to almost nothing once you started working. 30 minutes into the repair, I was making good progress. The fracture was sealing up nicely, and I figured I had maybe another 20 minutes of work left. That's when I caught something moving in my peripheral vision. I turned my head to look, keeping the torch steady with my right hand. About 50 feet away, something large was floating in the water. At first, I thought it might be debris, maybe a piece of equipment that had fallen from the platform. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was shaped like a person. The figure was massive, easily 7 feet tall and built like a linebacker. It hung motionless in the water, arms at its sides, facing in my direction. Even at this distance, I could make out what looked like a human face, but something about the proportions seemed wrong. The head was too large, the shoulders too broad. I blinked hard and looked again. Nitrogen narcosis could start affecting you at depths over 100 feet, and I was at 120. Hallucinations were one of the classic symptoms. Your brain started filling in details that weren't really there. I forced myself to look back at my work. The best way to deal with narcosis was to ignore whatever you thought you were seeing and focus on the task at hand. I'd heard other divers talk about their experiences, seeing mermaids, giant fish, even dead relatives floating in the water. The visions seemed real at the time, but they always disappeared if you didn't pay attention to them. The welding torch hissed as I continued working on the fracture. The metal was responding well, and I could see the crack sealing as I moved along its length. Just another routine repair job, I told myself. Nothing unusual about it. But when I glanced up again a few minutes later, the figure had moved closer. It was now maybe 20 feet away, still motionless, but definitely watching me. I could see more details now. Pale skin, dark hair that moved slowly in the current, and eyes that looked completely black from this distance. My hand started to shake slightly, and I had to steady the torch against the beam. This was exactly what you weren't supposed to do with narcosis hallucinations. The more attention you paid them, the more real they seemed to become. I'd heard stories of divers who got so fixated on their visions that they forgot to monitor their air supply or depth. I checked my gauges. Air was still good, depth holding steady at 120 feet. Everything was normal, except for the massive figure floating in the water nearby, watching my every movement with those black, unblinking eyes. The creature's mouth was slightly open, revealing what looked like normal human teeth. But there was something about the way it held itself in the water that didn't seem human at all. No person could float that motionless at this depth without some kind of equipment, and I couldn't see any diving gear on the figure. I tried to concentrate on finishing the weld, but I kept finding my eyes drawn back to the watching presence. It hadn't moved any closer in the last few minutes, but it also hadn't moved away. It just hung there in the water like it was studying me, waiting for something. The intensity of its stare was starting to get to me. Even if this was just nitrogen narcosis, the hallucination felt more real and detailed than anything I'd heard other divers describe. Most narcosis visions were supposed to be brief and fragmented, not sustained encounters like this. I finished another section of the weld and checked my progress. About 10 more minutes of work left, then I could start my ascent and get away from whatever this thing was. Real or not, I'd be glad to put some distance between myself and those black eyes that seemed to be tracking my every movement. The figure drifted slightly to one side, repositioning itself to maintain its view of my work area. The movement was fluid and deliberate, nothing like the random drift you'd expect from debris or a hallucination. It moved like something alive, something intelligent that was choosing where to position itself for the best view of what I was doing. The thing moved faster than anything had a right to move underwater. 1 second it was 20 feet away, watching me with those black eyes, and the next second it was right there, coming straight at me like a torpedo. I tried to back away from the support beam, but there wasn't anywhere to go. The creature slammed into me, and I felt something wrap around my shoulders. Not hands exactly, but something cold and impossibly strong. My regulator got knocked sideways in my mouth, and I had to bite down hard to keep from losing it completely. The pressure around my shoulders was crushing. Whatever had grabbed me was squeezing tight enough that I couldn't move my arms properly. I tried to reach for my emergency ascent system, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. The thing was holding me against the platform structure, pinning me there while I struggled to get free. My air gauge was right in front of my face, and I watched the needle drop as my breathing got faster. Panic was setting in, which was the last thing I needed at 120 feet down. I forced myself to slow my breathing and think through the situation logically. The pressure around my shoulders shifted, like whatever was holding me was adjusting its grip. I could feel something moving against my back, something that felt too big and too smooth to be human. The water around me got colder. Or maybe that was just my imagination running wild from the nitrogen narcosis. I counted to 10 and tried again to reach my emergency controls. This time my right hand made it to the inflation valve on my buoyancy compensator. I gave it a quick burst of air, hoping the sudden upward pull would break whatever hold the thing had on me. It worked. The pressure around my shoulders released all at once, and I shot upward about 3 feet before I could dump the excess air from my vest. When I looked around, the creature was gone. Just like that. Disappeared back into the murky water like it had never been there at all. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my underwater torch and finished the weld as fast as I could manage. The repair work that should have taken 20 minutes got done in about 8. I didn't care if it was perfect. I just wanted to get the hell away from that support beam and back to the surface. I started my ascent immediately, following all the safety protocols even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to rocket straight up. 15 feet per minute, with a safety stop at 15 feet. The whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those black eyes watching me from the depths. The safety stop was the longest 3 minutes of my life. I hung there at 15 feet, watching my dive computer count down the seconds while I scanned the water below me. Nothing moved except a few small fish and some floating debris. Whatever had grabbed me was long gone. When I finally broke the surface, Robert was waiting at the platform edge with the dive ladder already lowered. He helped me out of the water, and I could see the concern on his face as I pulled off my mask and regulator. "You're up early," he said, checking his watch. "That was only a 40-minute dive. Everything okay down there?" I sat on the deck for a minute, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. My shoulders still ached where the thing had grabbed me, and I could swear I felt bruises forming under my wetsuit. "Something grabbed me," I said finally. "Down by the support beam. Something big." Robert's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like understanding. He sat down next to me on the deck and handed me a towel. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "Don't leave anything out." So I told him. The creature watching me from 20 feet away. The way it moved through the water. How it grabbed me around the shoulders and held me against the platform structure. The cold pressure and the way it disappeared when I used my buoyancy compensator to break free. Robert listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally like he'd heard similar stories before. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the water. "Marcus," he said finally, "how deep were you when this happened?" 120 feet. Same as always for that repair." "And how long had you been down there?" I thought about it. "Maybe 15 minutes, 20 at the most." Robert nodded again. "That's nitrogen narcosis," he said. "Classic case. You were at depth long enough for the nitrogen to build up in your system, and your brain started playing tricks on you." "It didn't feel like a hallucination," I said. "I can still feel where it grabbed me." "That's how narcosis works," Robert explained. "It's not like seeing pink elephants or anything obvious. Your brain creates experiences that feel completely real. The pressure you felt, the cold sensation, that's all your nervous system responding to the nitrogen buildup." He stood up and offered me a hand. "Come on, let's get you some coffee and let your system clear out. You'll feel better in an hour or two." I let him pull me to my feet, but I wasn't convinced. The encounter had felt too real, too specific. The way the creature moved, the intelligence in those black eyes, that wasn't some random brain misfire from too much nitrogen. "How many divers report this kind of thing?" I asked as we walked toward the platform's main structure. "More than you'd think," Robert said. "Especially guys who've been doing deep work for a while. Your brain gets used to the nitrogen, but every now and then it hits you harder than usual. Could be you didn't eat enough breakfast. or you're more tired than you realized. We reached the break room, and Robert poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that was always brewing. He handed me one and sat down across from me at the small table. "The important thing is that you handled it right," he said. "You didn't panic. You followed your training, and you got yourself safely to the surface. That's exactly what you're supposed to do when narcosis hits." I sipped the coffee and tried to process what he was telling me. Nitrogen narcosis was something every diver learned about in training, but I'd never experienced anything like what had just happened. The brief, fragmented visions that other divers described were nothing like the sustained, detailed encounter I'd just had. "Have you ever had narcosis that intense?" I asked. Robert was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Once," he said finally. "About 10 years ago, working on a platform in the North Sea. I was convinced there was another diver down there with me trying to steal my tools. Spent 20 minutes chasing shadows before I realized what was happening." "But you knew it wasn't real?" "Not at the time," he admitted. "It felt completely real until I surfaced and my head cleared. That's the tricky thing about narcosis. Your brain doesn't know it's being fooled." I finished my coffee and tried to shake off the lingering unease from the dive. Robert's explanation made sense from a medical standpoint, but something about the encounter still bothered me. The creature had seemed too purposeful, too aware of what it was doing. "I want you to take the rest of the day off," Robert said. "Let your system clear completely before your next dive. And next time you're working at depth, keep your dive time shorter, 30 minutes maximum, until we're sure this won't happen again." I nodded and headed back to my quarters to change out of my wetsuit. As I peeled off the neoprene, I checked my shoulders for the bruises I was sure would be there. The skin was slightly red where I'd felt the pressure, but there were no actual marks. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe my brain had created the whole experience out of nitrogen buildup and too much time at depth. But as I hung up my gear and tried to put the encounter out of my mind, I couldn't shake the memory of those black, unblinking eyes staring at me with what had looked like unmistakable intelligence. I walked back onto Platform 12 the following Monday morning, trying to shake off the nerves that had been eating at me all weekend. Robert was waiting by the equipment lockers with my work order, same as always, but I could tell he was watching me more carefully than usual. "Morning, Marcus," he said, handing me the clipboard. "Pipeline connection on the south leg, about 80 feet down. Should be straightforward." I nodded and took the paperwork, scanning the details. Standard repair work, a loose coupling that needed tightening and some minor welding around the joint. The kind of job I could do in my sleep under normal circumstances. But nothing felt normal anymore. "You feeling all right?" Robert asked. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine," I said, though my hands were already starting to feel clammy. "Just didn't sleep great last night." That was an understatement. I'd barely slept at all, replaying that encounter from last week over and over in my head. The way that thing had grabbed me, the cold pressure around my shoulders, those black eyes staring at me like it was studying every move I made. Robert kept insisting it was nitrogen narcosis, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. I suited up slowly, double-checking every piece of equipment. My wetsuit felt heavier than usual, and my hands shook slightly as I tested my regulator. The familiar routine should have been calming, but instead it just reminded me that I was about to go back down there where that thing was waiting. "Water temp's about 68 degrees today," Robert said, helping me with my tank harness. "Visibility's decent, maybe 40 feet. Take your time down there, no rush." I nodded and walked to the platform edge, looking down at the dark water. Somewhere below, that pipeline needed fixing, and somewhere else below, that creature might be waiting for me again. I tried to push the thought away as I performed my final equipment check. "Radio check," I said into my comm unit. "Copy that, Marcus. Reading you loud and clear." I took a deep breath and stepped backward off the platform. The descent felt different this time. Every shadow in the water made my heart race. Every piece of floating debris looked like it might be something watching me. I kept my eyes moving constantly, scanning the murky water around me as I dropped toward the south leg of the platform. At 80 feet, I found the pipeline connection exactly where the work order said it would be. The coupling was loose, just like Robert had described, with some minor corrosion around the joint that would need cleaning before I could weld it properly. I got to work, trying to focus on the familiar tasks, but I couldn't concentrate. Every few seconds I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking the water around me for any sign of movement. The pipeline work that should have taken 20 minutes was stretching longer as I kept losing focus. That's when I saw it again. The massive shape materialized out of the murky water about 30 feet away, just at the edge of my visibility. Same as before. Humanoid, but wrong. Too big and too pale, with those black eyes that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. But this time it didn't approach. It just hovered there in the water, watching me. My hands started shaking so badly I had to stop welding. I tried to steady myself against the pipeline, taking slow breaths through my regulator. The creature hadn't moved any closer, but it hadn't left either. It was just floating there, staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I forced myself to look back at the pipeline connection and continue working. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away like last time. But every time I glanced up from my work, it was still there, 30 feet away, perfectly motionless except for the slight drift of the current. The welding torch felt clumsy in my shaking hands. I managed to clean the corrosion from around the joint and started the actual repair work, but I could feel those black eyes on me the entire time. It was like being watched by something that understood exactly what I was doing, studying my every movement. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The creature never moved closer, but it never left either. It just maintained that perfect distance, watching me work with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. This wasn't some random hallucination caused by nitrogen buildup. This thing was deliberately observing me, learning about me. I finished tightening the coupling and completed the weld around the joint, checking my work twice to make sure it was solid. The whole time, that pale shape remained at the edge of my vision, a constant presence that made every simple task feel like a monumental effort. When I finally started my ascent, following the safety protocols and rising slowly, the creature stayed where it was. I looked back down as I climbed toward the surface, and I could still see it there in the depths, watching me leave. It didn't follow this time, but somehow that felt even worse. Like it was confident I'd be back. I broke the surface, gasping, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of the waves. Robert was waiting at the dive ladder, and he helped pull me up onto the platform deck. "How'd it go down there?" he asked. But I could see the concern in his eyes as he looked at my face. "I saw it again," I said, pulling off my mask. "The same thing as last week. It was there the whole time, just watching me work." Robert's expression grew more serious. He helped me out of my gear while I described the encounter, how the creature had appeared early in the dive and maintained its distance but never stopped staring at me, how it seemed to be studying my movements with obvious intelligence. "Marcus," Robert said when I finished, "this is the second time in a week. That's not normal, even for nitrogen narcosis." "I know it's not normal," I said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. This thing isn't some hallucination. It's real, and it's watching me." Robert was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he made a decision that I could see forming in his expression. "I want you to see Dr. Mitchell," he said. "Today. We need to get you checked out properly. You think I'm losing my mind. I think you're having persistent hallucinations while diving, and that's dangerous for everyone on this platform. Dr. Mitchell can run some tests, maybe figure out what's causing this." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I was seeing was real, but I could hear how crazy it sounded, even to me. A mysterious underwater creature that watched me work. Who would believe that? "All right," I said. "I'll go see her." Robert nodded, looking relieved. "Good. I'll call ahead and let her know you're coming. Take the rest of the day off. No more diving until we figure this out." I gathered my gear and headed for the crew quarters to change out of my wetsuit. As I walked across the platform deck, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere far below in the dark water, those black eyes were still watching, still waiting for my return. Dr. Mitchell's office was on the second floor of the medical building, about 20 minutes from the platform. I'd been there once before for my annual physical, but this felt different. Robert had called ahead like he promised, so she was expecting me. The waiting room was empty except for a receptionist who barely looked up when I walked in. I sat down in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs and tried not to think about what I was going to tell her. How do you explain to a doctor that you keep seeing some kind of creature underwater without sounding completely crazy? "Marcus Chen?" Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway after about 10 minutes. She looked professional in her white coat, with her auburn hair pulled back and those wire-rimmed glasses. "Come on back." Her office was small but organized. Medical certificates hung on the walls, and her desk was covered with neat stacks of papers. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Robert mentioned you've been having some unusual experiences during your dives," she said, settling into her chair and pulling out a clipboard. "Why don't you tell me what's been happening?" I went through the whole thing again. The first encounter near the support beam, how something had grabbed me and held me against the platform structure. The second dive where I'd seen it watching from a distance. I tried to keep my voice steady, but even to my own ears it sounded unbelievable. Dr. Mitchell took notes while I talked, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "Robert thinks it might be nitrogen narcosis," I said, "but I've been diving for 5 years. I know what that feels like." "Nitrogen narcosis can affect people differently," she said, "and it doesn't always happen the same way every time. Stress, fatigue, even changes in your physical condition can make you more susceptible." She asked me to sit on the examination table and started checking my blood pressure. The cuff squeezed tight around my arm while the machine hummed. "When did you last have a full physical?" she asked, watching the numbers on the display. "About 8 months ago. Everything was normal." She checked my pulse, looked in my ears and throat, tested my reflexes with that little rubber hammer. The whole routine took about 20 minutes. She had me breathe deeply while she listened to my lungs, then checked my heart rate again. "Physically, you're in excellent shape," she said when we were done. "Blood pressure's a little elevated, but that's probably just stress from the situation." I sat back down in the chair while she made more notes on her clipboard. "The thing is," I said, "what I saw didn't feel like a hallucination. It was too real, too detailed. And it happened twice now, exactly the same way." Dr. Mitchell nodded. "That's actually not uncommon with nitrogen narcosis. The brain can create very vivid, very consistent experiences. Sometimes divers report seeing the same hallucination multiple times, especially if they're anxious about it happening again." She opened a desk drawer and pulled out a small bottle of pills. "I'm going to prescribe something for anxiety," she said, writing on a prescription pad. "It should help you stay calmer during dives, which might prevent the narcosis from occurring." The bottle was small and white, with a label I couldn't quite read from where I was sitting. She handed me the prescription along with a pamphlet about diving safety. "I also want you to take a full week off from diving," she said. "No underwater work at all. Let your system clear out completely." A week? I thought about what Robert would say. We had jobs scheduled for the next few days. "It's necessary. If there's any nitrogen buildup in your tissues, we need to give it time to dissipate completely. After that, we'll start you back with shorter dives and see how you do." She walked me to the door and shook my hand. Her grip was firm and professional. "Don't worry about this too much," she said. "Nitrogen narcosis is more common than people think. With the right precautions, there's no reason you can't continue diving safely." I drove back to my apartment with the prescription in my pocket and Dr. Mitchell's words echoing in my head. She'd been thorough, professional, reassuring. Everything she said made perfect medical sense. But sitting in my living room that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was wrong. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for information about nitrogen narcosis. The medical websites all said basically the same thing Dr. Mitchell had told me. It typically occurred at depths over 100 feet. It caused confusion, euphoria, and sometimes hallucinations. The effects were usually brief and fragmented. I read case studies and research papers until my eyes burned. Divers reported seeing lights that weren't there, feeling like they were flying, or becoming convinced they could breathe water. But none of the accounts described anything like what I'd experienced. The creature I'd seen was too detailed, too consistent, too intelligent. The next day, I went to the library and found books about diving medicine. I spent hours reading about decompression sickness, oxygen toxicity, and psychological effects of deep diving. The more I read, the more convinced I became that nitrogen narcosis didn't explain what was happening to me. The hallucinations described in the literature were random, chaotic. People saw flashing lights or felt like they were drunk. They didn't see the same specific creature multiple times, watching them with obvious intelligence. They didn't feel something grab them with deliberate strength and hold them in place. I started researching other possibilities. Maybe there was some kind of marine life I wasn't familiar with. I looked up large fish species in the Gulf of Mexico, marine mammals, even prehistoric creatures that might still exist in deep water. Nothing matched what I'd seen. By the third day of my forced break, I was spending 12 hours a day online, reading everything I could find about underwater encounters. I found forums where divers shared strange experiences, but most of them sounded like obvious hallucinations or exaggerations. A few accounts were more detailed, more believable, but they were scattered across different locations and time periods. The medication Dr. Mitchell had prescribed sat unopened on my kitchen counter. I'd read the side effects and didn't like what I saw. Drowsiness, reduced reaction time, possible memory problems. Those weren't things I wanted to deal with while diving. On the fourth day, I called Robert to check in. He asked how I was feeling and whether the time off was helping. I told him I felt fine physically, which was true. What I didn't tell him was that I was becoming more convinced that something real was happening during my dives, not some medical condition. "Dr. Mitchell thinks you'll be ready to go back to work next week," he said. "We'll start you with some shallow jobs, nothing over 60 feet." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the prescription bottle. Dr. Mitchell had been thorough and professional. She'd found nothing wrong with me physically. According to everything I'd read, nitrogen narcosis was the most logical explanation for what I'd experienced. But logic didn't explain the intelligence I'd seen in those black eyes, or the deliberate way the creature had moved. It didn't explain why I felt like I was being studied, rather than just hallucinating random images. I opened the bottle and shook one of the small white pills into my palm. Such a tiny thing to supposedly solve such a big problem. I put it back and closed the bottle. The week passed slowly. I tried to relax, tried to convince myself that Dr. Mitchell was right and the medication would help. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that massive pale shape hovering in the water, watching me with those unblinking black eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I went back to work the following Monday, trying to convince myself that Dr. Mitchell was right about the nitrogen narcosis. Robert had me scheduled for 3 dives that week, all on different platforms. Maybe the change of scenery would help reset whatever was going on in my head. The first dive was on Platform 4, a routine inspection of the main support columns. I suited up like normal, ran through my equipment checks, and tried to push down the anxiety that had been building in my chest since I woke up that morning. Robert handed me the work order and gave me his usual safety briefing about water conditions. "Temperature's about 72 degrees down there," he said, checking his clipboard. "Visibility's good, maybe 40 feet. Take your time with the inspection." I nodded and stepped backward off the platform into the water. The descent felt different this time. Every few feet down, I found myself scanning the water around me, looking for any sign of movement in the blue-green murk. By the time I reached the support columns at 90 feet, my heart was already beating faster than it should have been. I started the inspection on the northeast column, checking for stress fractures and corrosion. The work was straightforward, just visual examination and some measurements with my gauge. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those black eyes staring at me from the darkness. Then I saw it. The creature was there, maybe 15 feet away, just floating motionless in the water. Same massive size, same pale skin, same unblinking black eyes. But this time it was closer than before, and it seemed to be studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Its mouth was slightly open, like it was about to say something, though I knew that was impossible underwater. I forced myself to keep working, measuring the column diameter and checking for any signs of damage. But the whole time, I could feel those eyes on me. The creature didn't move, didn't approach, just watched. When I finished with the first column and moved to the second one, it followed me, maintaining that same 15-foot distance. By the time I completed the inspection and started my ascent, my air consumption was way higher than normal. I'd burned through my tank much faster because of the stress and rapid breathing. The creature watched me rise for the first 30 feet, then disappeared back into the depths. Robert helped me up onto the platform deck, and I could see the concern in his eyes when he looked at my air gauge. "You went through that tank pretty quick," he said. "Everything okay down there?" "I saw it again," I told him, pulling off my mask. "The same thing. It was watching me the whole time." Robert's expression shifted from concern to something that looked like worry. "Marcus, we need to talk about this. This is the 3rd time now." The second dive was 2 days later on Platform 7. Same routine, same equipment checks, same growing anxiety as I prepared to descend. This time the job was welding a crack in one of the cross braces at 80 feet. Should have been simple work that I could do in my sleep. But the creature showed up again, this time even closer, maybe 10 feet away, positioned where I could see it clearly while I worked. It hung there in the water, like it was suspended by invisible strings, those black eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that made my hands shake. The mouth was open again, just slightly, and I had the strangest feeling that it was trying to communicate something. I tried to focus on the welding, but my hands were trembling so badly that I had to stop twice to steady myself. The creature's presence was overwhelming, like it was pressing against my consciousness somehow. I'd never experienced anything like it during my 5 years of diving. When I finally finished the weld and started packing up my equipment, the creature moved, not away, but closer. It approached to within maybe 8 feet, close enough that I could see details I'd never noticed before. Its skin wasn't just pale, it had an almost translucent quality, and I could see what looked like veins or channels running beneath the surface. The eyes weren't completely black either. There were depths to them, like looking into dark water. I activated my ascent system and rose as quickly as safety protocols allowed. The creature followed me up for about 20 feet, then vanished into the blue-green darkness below. Robert was waiting for me at the surface with the same worried expression he'd worn after my previous dive. "How'd it go down there?" he asked, though I could tell from his tone that he already suspected the answer. "It was there again," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Closer this time. Much closer." Robert helped me out of my gear in silence. When we were sitting in the break room with coffee, he leaned forward and looked me straight in the eye. "Marcus, I think you need to talk to someone about this. Someone who specializes in what divers go through." "You mean a shrink?" "I mean a therapist who understands the psychological pressures of deep sea work. There's a guy named Dr. Rodriguez who works with a lot of our divers. He's helped people through some tough situations." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I was seeing was real, but the look on Robert's face told me that wasn't going to work. He was genuinely concerned about my mental state, and I couldn't blame him. If one of my co-workers had told me the same story, I probably would have reacted the same way. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll talk to him." The third dive happened the next week on Platform 12. By then, I was dreading every descent, but I couldn't quit without losing my job and my reputation in the diving community. Word traveled fast in our business, and if people thought I was losing my mind, I'd never work underwater again. This time, the creature appeared almost immediately after I reached the work site at 75 feet. It was closer than ever before, maybe 6 feet away, and its behavior was different. Instead of just floating and watching, it seemed agitated. It moved in small circles around me, never taking those black eyes off my face. I was supposed to be replacing a damaged valve on one of the intake pipes, but I could barely concentrate on the work. The creature's presence was so overwhelming that I kept losing track of what I was doing. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my wrench twice, watching it tumble down into the darker water below. The creature's mouth opened wider this time, and I could see rows of what looked like teeth, though they were unlike anything I'd ever seen on a fish or marine animal. They were more like crystalline formations, translucent and sharp. But what disturbed me most was the way it kept positioning itself directly in my line of sight, as if it wanted to make sure I was paying attention to it, rather than my work. I managed to get the old valve removed, but installing the new one took 3 times longer than it should have. Every time I tried to focus on threading the connections, the creature would move closer or shift position, drawing my attention back to those unblinking eyes. It was like it was deliberately trying to interfere with my work. When I finally finished and started my ascent, the creature followed me up further than it ever had before. It stayed with me until I was maybe 30 feet from the surface, close enough that the platform's shadow was visible above us. Only then did it turn and disappear back into the depths. I broke the surface gasping, not from exertion but from the stress of the encounter. Robert was there waiting, and one look at my face told him everything he needed to know. "That's it," he said, helping me onto the platform. "You're seeing Dr. Rodriguez tomorrow. I'm calling him as soon as we get back to shore." Dr. Rodriguez's office was in a medical building about 20 minutes from the harbor. I'd never been to a therapist before, and I wasn't sure what to expect. The waiting room was small and quiet, with generic landscape paintings on the walls and a receptionist who barely looked up when I walked in. "Marcus Chen?" Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway after about 10 minutes. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Come on back." His office was comfortable but professional, with diplomas on the walls and a bookshelf filled with medical texts. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from his desk. "Robert Hayes called me about you," he said, settling into his own chair and picking up a notepad. "He's concerned about some experiences you've been having during your dives." I told him everything. The first sighting, the physical contact, the increasingly aggressive behavior, the way the creature seemed to be studying me. Dr. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on his pad. "How long have you been diving professionally?" he asked when I finished. "5 years. Never had anything like this happen before." "And these encounters? They're happening at various depths and locations?" "Yeah. Different platforms, different depths. But it's the same creature every time." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Marcus, what you're describing sounds like a form of persistent hallucination brought on by the extreme stress of deep-sea work. The human mind has remarkable ways of coping with dangerous environments, and sometimes those coping mechanisms can create very vivid, very real-seeming experiences. But it feels completely real. I can see details, the way it moves, the way it looks at me. That's exactly what makes these stress-induced hallucinations so convincing. Your brain is creating a consistent narrative, a persistent presence that represents your subconscious fears about diving. The fact that the creature's behavior is escalating mirrors your own increasing anxiety about your work." He leaned forward slightly. "The good news is that this is treatable. We can work on stress management techniques, and I can prescribe medication to help control the anxiety that's triggering these episodes." Over the next hour, Dr. Rodriguez taught me breathing exercises and visualization techniques designed to help manage stress during dives. He explained how the mind could create patterns and meaning where none existed, especially under the psychological pressure of working in a dangerous environment. "The key is to recognize that your mind is trying to protect you by creating a focal point for your fears," he said. "Once we address the underlying anxiety, these sightings should decrease and eventually stop altogether." He wrote me a prescription for anti-anxiety medication and scheduled weekly sessions for the next month. As I left his office, I wanted to believe that he was right, that everything I'd experienced could be explained by stress and hallucinations. But deep down, I couldn't shake the memory of those black eyes and the intelligence I'd seen in them. Whatever was watching me in the depths felt far too real to be just a product of my imagination. The medication Dr. Rodriguez prescribed sat in my bathroom cabinet, untouched for 3 weeks now. I'd tried taking it the first few days, but the pills made me feel foggy and disconnected from everything around me. Being underwater with clouded judgment seemed more dangerous than dealing with whatever was happening down there, so I'd stopped. But the encounters kept happening anyway. Every single dive for the past month, the Watcher showed up. Not just brief glimpses anymore. The thing followed me around like some kind of underwater shadow. I'd swim from one support beam to another, and it would glide along beside me, always keeping that same distance of 10 to 20 feet. Never closer, never farther. Today's dive was on platform 15, and I could feel my hands shaking as I suited up. Robert handed me the work order without his usual small talk. He'd been watching me carefully lately, probably wondering if I was losing it completely. "Just a routine inspection on the southeast leg," he said. "Should be straightforward." I nodded and checked my gear one more time. The water was calm, visibility decent at about 30 feet. I stepped backward off the platform and started my descent to 90 feet. It took maybe 2 minutes before I saw the familiar pale shape moving through the water below me. The watcher was already there, waiting near the platform structure like it knew exactly where I was headed. As I approached the southeast leg, the creature positioned itself between two support beams, watching me with those black eyes. I started my inspection, checking for stress fractures and corrosion along the metal joints. The watcher moved when I moved, staying parallel to my position as I worked my way around the structure. When I swam to the next beam, it was already there ahead of me, like it had anticipated where I was going. That's what bothered me most, the intelligence behind its movements. This wasn't random. The thing was thinking, planning, staying one step ahead of my work pattern. I'd seen enough sea life during my 5 years of diving to know the difference between animal behavior and something else entirely. I finished checking the first section and moved toward the cross braces. The watcher followed, maintaining that precise distance. When I stopped to examine a weld joint, it stopped too. When I moved to the next section, it glided along beside me like an escort. My air consumption was higher than normal again. The stress of being watched constantly was making me breathe faster, even though I tried to stay calm. I forced myself to focus on the inspection, measuring corrosion depths and checking bolt tightness. The creature never interfered with my work directly, but its presence made everything take longer. I kept glancing over to make sure it was still there, still keeping its distance. Part of me wondered what would happen if I swam directly toward it, but I wasn't ready to find out. After 40 minutes underwater, I'd completed the full inspection. The watcher had followed me to every single location, positioning itself perfectly to observe my work. As I started my ascent, it rose with me for the first 30 feet, then disappeared into the darker water below. Robert was waiting at the surface with the dive ladder ready. He helped me up onto the platform deck, his eyes scanning my face for signs of trouble. "How'd it go down there?" he asked. "Fine. No major issues with the structure." I pulled off my mask and started working on my tank harness. But it was there again. Robert's expression shifted to that familiar look of concern mixed with frustration. "Marcus, we've talked about this. Dr. Rodriguez said—" "I know what he said," I interrupted, stepping out of my fins. "But I'm telling you, this thing follows me around down there. It's not random hallucinations. The medication should be helping with that. I didn't mention that I'd stopped taking the pills. It's not helping because this isn't in my head." Robert sighed and handed me a towel. "You've got another session with Dr. Rodriguez tomorrow, right?" "Yeah." I dried off my face, already dreading the appointment. But he's not going to believe me any more than you do. The next afternoon, I sat in Dr. Rodriguez's office for what felt like the 100th time. His notepad was open on his lap, pen ready to document whatever crazy thing I was going to say next. "How have the dives been going this week?" he asked. "Same as always. The creature shows up, follows me around, watches everything I do." Dr. Rodriguez wrote something down. "And you're taking the medication as prescribed?" I hesitated. I tried it for a few days, but it made me feel disconnected. That's dangerous when you're working underwater. "Marcus, the medication is designed to help reduce anxiety and the associated hallucinations. If you're not taking it consistently, we can't expect to see improvement." "But what if they're not hallucinations?" I leaned forward in my chair. What if something is actually down there? We've discussed this extensively. The pattern you're describing, a creature that appears only during your dives, behaves intelligently, but leaves no physical evidence. These are classic symptoms of stress-induced hallucinations, combined with pattern-seeking behavior. I felt that familiar frustration building. So you think my brain is just making up the fact that it anticipates where I'm going to work next? Your mind is creating patterns where none exist. When you're underwater and anxious, you're hyper-aware of your surroundings. You notice every shadow, every movement in the water. Your brain then connects these random observations into a narrative that feels real and consistent. Dr. Rodriguez set down his pen and looked at me directly. The human mind is remarkably good at creating coherent stories from disconnected experiences, especially under stress. What you're experiencing feels absolutely real because, to your brain, it is real. But the behavior is so specific, it's not just random sightings. That's because your anxiety has a specific focus, your work underwater. Your hallucinations naturally center around that environment and follow the patterns of your daily routine. I sat back in my chair, feeling more isolated than ever. Dr. Rodriguez meant well, but he wasn't down there with me. He hadn't seen the intelligence in those black eyes or the way the creature moved with purpose and planning. I want you to try the medication again, he continued. Start with a lower dose if the full amount made you feel foggy, and I'm recommending we increase our sessions to twice a week for the next month. Twice a week? Marcus, you're describing increasingly detailed and persistent hallucinations. This suggests your stress levels are rising, not improving. We need to address this more aggressively before it affects your safety or your ability to work. I agreed to the increased sessions because I didn't have much choice. Robert was already concerned about my mental state, and refusing therapy would probably get me pulled from diving duty entirely. But as I left Dr. Rodriguez's office, I felt more alone than ever. Everyone around me, Robert, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Rodriguez, they all had their explanations for what was happening. Nitrogen narcosis, stress-induced hallucinations, pattern-seeking behavior. They had medical terms and logical theories for everything. None of them had been down there with me. None of them had seen the way the Watcher moved with deliberate intelligence, positioning itself perfectly to observe my work. None of them had felt the weight of those black eyes studying every movement I made. The diving community was small and tight-knit. Word traveled fast about divers who couldn't handle the pressure, who started seeing things that weren't there. If I kept insisting that something real was happening during my dives, my reputation would be finished. No one would hire a welder who claimed to see underwater creatures. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the only person who understood what was really going on down there. The Watcher wasn't a hallucination or a stress response. It was something real, something intelligent, and it had been studying me for weeks now. I drove back to my apartment, dreading tomorrow's dive schedule. Platform 8 this time, another routine inspection in 90 feet of water. The Watcher would be there, waiting for me like always. It would follow me around the platform structure, maintaining that perfect distance, watching everything I did with those unblinking black eyes. And I'd come back to the surface with another story that no one would believe. I woke up Monday morning with my stomach already twisted in knots. Platform 9 was on the schedule, and I'd been dreading it all weekend. The coffee tasted like dirt, but I forced it down anyway while staring at the work order Robert had given me Friday afternoon. Valve assembly replacement on the southwest leg, 85 feet down. Should have been routine work, maybe an hour underwater if everything went smoothly. But nothing went smoothly anymore. Not since the Watcher had decided I was worth following around. I drove to the platform with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. The morning was clear, water calm as glass, but that didn't make me feel any better. Good conditions just meant I'd have no excuse if something went wrong down there. Robert was waiting by the equipment lockers when I climbed up from the boat dock. He handed me the clipboard without his usual small talk, just watched me scan the details with that worried look he'd been wearing for weeks now. Water temp 74 degrees, he said. Visibility's about 35 feet. Take your time down there, Marcus. I nodded and started suiting up. My hands were already shaking a little as I pulled on the wetsuit, and I had to stop twice to get the zipper lined up right. The weight belt felt heavier than usual, or maybe that was just my imagination. Everything felt off these days. "You sure you're up for this?" Robert asked while I checked my regulator. "We could push this job to next week if you need more time." "I'm fine," I lied, testing the emergency ascent system. "Just need to get back in the water and do the work." He didn't look convinced, but he helped me with the tank harness anyway. I ran through my equipment check twice, then did the radio test. Everything was working perfectly, which somehow made me more nervous instead of less. "Okay, I'm going down," I said, walking to the platform edge. "Be careful down there," Robert said. "And Marcus, if you see anything that doesn't feel right, just come back up. The valve can wait." I stepped backward off the platform before I could change my mind. The water was warm and clear, just like Robert had said. I descended slowly, watching my depth gauge tick past 20 feet, then 40, then 60. My breathing was already too fast, and I forced myself to slow it down. Wasting air before I even started working was stupid, but I couldn't help scanning the water around me every few seconds. At 70 feet, I spotted the platform structure below me. The southwest leg was easy to find, and I could see the valve assembly that needed replacing about 15 feet down from where I was. I kicked downward, following the support beam, and reached the work site at exactly 85 feet. That's when I saw the Watcher. It was already there, hanging motionless about 20 feet away, those black eyes fixed on me like always. But something was different this time. Instead of just floating in place and staring, the creature started moving. It began swimming in a slow circle around me and the platform structure. Not fast, not aggressive, just a steady, deliberate movement that kept it at the same distance while it orbited my position. I tried to ignore it and focus on the valve assembly, but my eyes kept tracking the pale shape as it moved through the water. I pulled out my tools and started working on the first bolt. The wrench slipped twice before I got a good grip, and I realized my hands were shaking worse than usual. The Watcher completed its first circle and started a second one, moving with that same hypnotic rhythm. The bolt finally came loose and I moved to the second one, but I couldn't stop watching the creature's movement. There was something deliberate about the pattern, like it was trying to tell me something, or maybe just trying to drive me crazy. Each time it passed in front of me, those black eyes stayed locked on mine for a few seconds before it continued the circle. I dropped the wrench. It tumbled down into the darkness below the platform, and I cursed into my regulator. I had a backup tool, but losing equipment was exactly the kind of mistake that happened when you couldn't concentrate. I pulled out the second wrench and went back to work, but the Watcher just kept circling. Third bolt, fourth bolt. The creature never varied its pattern, never changed speed, never looked away. It was like being watched by some kind of underwater predator that was taking its time deciding whether to attack. My air consumption was way too high, and I kept having to check my gauge to make sure I wasn't burning through my supply too fast. The old valve assembly finally came free, and I set it aside on a platform ledge. The Watcher completed another circle, and I found myself counting them. 7 so far, maybe 8. I couldn't be sure because I kept losing track when I tried to focus on the work. Installing the new valve should have been straightforward, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The first fitting took me 3 tries to get threaded properly, and I had to stop twice to slow my breathing down. The Watcher just kept moving in that same steady circle, like a shark that had caught a scent. I got the second fitting attached and started on the third one. The creature passed in front of me again, and this time I noticed something different about its movement. It was getting closer. Not by much, maybe a foot or two, but definitely closer than when it had started. My heart rate spiked, and I fumbled the wrench again. This time I managed to catch it before it fell, but just barely. I forced myself to look only at the valve assembly, to ignore the pale shape moving through my peripheral vision, but it was impossible. The thing was right there, circling me like I was prey. Fourth fitting, fifth fitting. The watcher completed another circle, definitely closer now, maybe 15 feet away instead of 20. I could see more details of its face, the way its mouth hung slightly open, the complete absence of any expression in those black eyes. I finished the last fitting and started the pressure test. The gauge showed good readings, no leaks, everything working like it should. But I could barely focus on the numbers because the watcher was still circling, still getting incrementally closer with each pass. 12 circles now, maybe 13. The creature was close enough that I could see the texture of its pale skin, the way the water moved around its body as it swam. It never made any sound, never showed any sign of effort, just maintained that steady, hypnotic movement that was driving me half crazy. I packed up my tools with shaking hands and checked the valve assembly one more time. Everything looked good. Job complete. Time to get out of there. But the watcher was still circling, and I had the horrible feeling that it was waiting for something. I started my ascent, rising slowly according to safety protocols, even though every instinct was screaming at me to get to the surface as fast as possible. The creature followed me up for the first 30 feet, maintaining its circular pattern around me as I rose through the water. Then, just like always, it stopped following and disappeared back into the depths. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, leaving me alone in the blue water with my racing heart and the memory of those black eyes. I broke the surface gasping, not from lack of air, but from pure stress. Robert was waiting at the platform edge with the dive ladder already lowered, and he helped pull me up onto the deck. "How'd it go down there?" he asked, but I could tell from his expression that he already knew the answer. "The valve's fixed," I said, pulling off my mask. "No problems with the installation." "That's not what I meant. And you know it." I sat down hard on the deck and started working on my weight belt. My hands were still shaking, and it took me 3 tries to get the buckle undone. "It was there again," I said finally. But this time it was different. It wasn't just watching. It was circling me, over and over, like it was studying me or trying to make me panic. Robert handed me a towel and sat down beside me. "Marcus, you've got to start taking that medication Dr. Rodriguez prescribed. This is getting worse, not better." "It's not a hallucination," I said, probably for the 100th time. "I know what I saw down there. The thing was circling me for 40 minutes straight, getting closer each time." "That's not how hallucinations work." "That's exactly how they work when you're under stress," Robert said. "Look, I've been diving for 20 years and I've seen guys go through this before. The mind plays tricks when you're dealing with pressure and anxiety." I pulled off my fins and stood up, water dripping from my wetsuit onto the deck. The valve replacement was done. The job was complete, but I felt like I'd barely survived the dive. And tomorrow there would be another platform, another dive, another encounter with the Watcher. "I need this job, Robert," I said. "I can't just quit because of some creature that nobody believes exists." "You need help more than you need this job," he said. "And if you keep diving in this condition, you're going to get yourself killed." I walked over to the equipment locker and started hanging up my gear. The wetsuit felt heavy and cold against my skin, and I couldn't wait to get out of it. But even changing clothes wouldn't get rid of the memory of those circles, that hypnotic pattern that had made concentrating on simple tasks almost impossible. Robert was probably right about the danger. My hands had been shaking so badly that I'd nearly dropped tools twice, and my air consumption had been way too high. If the Watcher decided to do something more aggressive than just circling, I wasn't sure I'd be able to handle it. But I also wasn't sure I could handle quitting. This job was all I knew, all I was good at. Without underwater welding, I'd have to start over completely, probably making half the money doing work I didn't understand. I finished hanging up the gear and grabbed my street clothes from the locker. The sun was getting higher, and the platform deck was starting to heat up, but I still felt cold from the dive, or maybe from the fear. I suited up for the dive at platform 11 with the same knots in my stomach I'd been carrying for weeks. Robert handed me the clipboard without his usual small talk, just pointed to the work order. Routine inspection on the north support leg, 95 feet down. Nothing complicated, but that didn't matter anymore. The Watcher would be there. "Water's calm today," Robert said, checking his watch. "Visibility about 35 feet. Temperature's holding at 74 degrees. I nodded and pulled on my wetsuit, my hands already starting to shake. The zipper caught halfway up, and I had to work it loose before getting it closed. My weight belt felt heavier than usual as I buckled it around my waist. "You sure you're good for this?" Robert asked, watching me fumble with my tank harness. "I'm fine," I lied, testing my regulator. The airflow was steady. Emergency ascent system checked out. Everything was working perfectly except me. I walked to the platform edge and looked down at the dark water. Somewhere below, the Watcher was already waiting. It always knew when I was coming. "Going down," I said, and stepped backward off the platform. The water closed over my head, and I started my descent. 20 feet, 40 feet, 60 feet. My depth gauge ticked steadily downward as I kicked toward the platform structure. At 80 feet, I could see the massive support legs stretching down into the murky depths. That's when I saw it. The Watcher wasn't keeping its usual distance this time. Instead of hovering 20 feet away, it was positioned directly below me, maybe 10 feet down. Its pale form looked bigger than before, more solid somehow. Those black eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached 90 feet and approached the north leg, trying to focus on my work. The inspection checklist was simple. Look for stress fractures, check the welds, note any corrosion. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my underwater light steady. The Watcher began moving. Not the slow, circling pattern I'd grown used to, but something more aggressive. It rose from the depths with powerful strokes, closing the distance between us rapidly. I backed against the platform structure, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature was only 5 feet away now, close enough that I could see the translucent quality of its skin, the way its mouth opened and closed in a rhythm that didn't match breathing. Then it rushed me. The impact knocked the regulator sideways in my mouth, and I bit down hard to keep it in place. Something incredibly strong wrapped around my waist. Not arms exactly, but appendages that felt both solid and fluid at the same time. The grip was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, like being caught in a vice made of living muscle. I tried to push away from the platform structure, but the Watcher was already pulling me in the opposite direction. Away from the safety of the support legs, away from the familiar territory I knew, toward the open water where the bottom dropped away into darkness. My emergency ascent system was clipped to my vest, but when I reached for it, the Watcher's grip tightened. I couldn't get my arm up far enough to activate the inflation valve. The creature was dragging me deeper, and my depth gauge showed 98 feet, then 100, then 105. I fought against the grip, twisting and kicking, but it was like trying to break free from a steel cable. The Watcher was impossibly strong, and it seemed to anticipate every move I made. When I tried to grab onto a piece of platform debris, it pulled me away before I could get a solid hold. 110 feet, 115. We were moving into water I'd never worked in before, where the platform structure was just a distant shadow above us. My air consumption was spiking from the panic and the exertion of fighting, but the Watcher showed no signs of slowing down. That's when something else happened. Something that made the physical assault feel like nothing. A pressure built inside my skull, different from nitrogen narcosis or the normal effects of depth. This was invasive, probing, like fingers made of ice water pushing into my brain. I tried to shake my head, tried to clear whatever was happening, but the sensation only grew stronger. Then the thoughts came. They weren't my thoughts. I knew that immediately because they felt completely alien, structured in a way that human thinking never was. Images flashed through my mind, vast underwater territories, ancient currents, the slow death of coral reefs. But these weren't memories or hallucinations. They were being placed in my consciousness by something else. The Watcher was inside my head. I could feel its presence like a cold weight pressing against the inside of my skull. It was examining my thoughts, sorting through my memories, learning about me in a way that felt like the most intimate violation imaginable. Every private moment, every fear, every hope I'd ever had was being cataloged by this creature. I tried to resist, tried to push the alien presence out of my mind, but I had no idea how to fight something like this. The telepathic invasion was overwhelming, flooding my consciousness with sensations and concepts that my human brain wasn't designed to process. The creature's grip around my waist never loosened as it continued dragging me deeper. 120 feet now, then 125. We were approaching the limits of safe diving depth, but the Watcher seemed unconcerned with human limitations. More thoughts that weren't mine flooded in. I saw the ocean as the Watcher saw it, not as a workplace or a resource to be exploited, but as a living entity with its own consciousness and needs. I felt its rage at the pollution, the overfishing, the constant intrusion of human machinery into spaces that had been pristine for millions of years. And I felt its attention focused specifically on me. The creature was studying my memories of diving, examining every job I'd done, every piece of equipment I'd used, every interaction I'd had with the marine environment. It was judging me, evaluating whether I belonged in its territory or whether I was just another threat to be eliminated. The telepathic contact was so intense that I almost forgot about the physical danger. My depth gauge read 130 feet, well beyond the safe limits for the air mixture I was breathing. But the Watcher's mental invasion was so overwhelming that the risk of nitrogen narcosis seemed secondary. I could feel the creature's intelligence, vast and alien and utterly inhuman. It had been watching human activity in these waters for decades, maybe longer. It had seen the gradual destruction of its domain, the slow poisoning of the ecosystem it protected, and it had been taking action. Images flashed through my mind of other divers, other workers who had ventured into these depths. I saw them through the Watcher's eyes, some respectful of the environment, others careless and destructive. And I saw what had happened to the ones who had shown no regard for the ocean's well-being. They had simply disappeared. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Watcher wasn't just observing human activity. It was actively eliminating threats to its territory. The missing divers, the unexplained accidents, the equipment failures that had plagued offshore operations for years. They weren't accidents at all. The creature's grip around my waist shifted, and I felt myself being turned to face those black, unblinking eyes. The telepathic contact intensified, and suddenly I could sense the Watcher's intentions as clearly as if they were my own thoughts. It was deciding whether to kill me. The pressure inside my skull intensified as the Watcher's presence filled my mind completely. I couldn't move, couldn't think my own thoughts. Everything was overwhelmed by this alien consciousness that had invaded every corner of my brain. Guardian, the voice said, not in words, but in concepts that formed directly in my understanding. Protector of the deep places. Images flooded my mind, vast underwater territories stretching for hundreds of miles, coral reefs teeming with life, schools of fish moving in perfect harmony. But then the images shifted, showing the same areas decades later, dead zones where nothing lived, bleached coral skeletons, oil slicks coating the surface above. I have watched, the Watcher continued, its mental voice carrying the weight of centuries. I have seen what your kind does to the waters, the poison you pour, the life you destroy. More images crashed through my consciousness. Underwater explosions from seismic testing, massive nets dragging across the ocean floor, chemical waste streaming from industrial pipes. Each image came with emotions that weren't mine: rage, sorrow, an ancient fury that made my chest tight. For 70 years I have eliminated the worst offenders, the Watcher said. Those who show no respect, who treat the ocean as their dumping ground. I saw flashes of other divers, men in old-style diving suits from decades past, modern commercial divers like myself, all of them underwater, all of them struggling in the Watcher's grip before going still. The images were brief but clear. Dozens of divers over the years, all who had shown carelessness or deliberate harm to the marine environment. But you, the Watcher's voice shifted, carrying something that might have been approval. You are different. New images filled my mind. Memories of my own dives that I was seeing through the Watcher's eyes. Me carefully maneuvering around a school of fish instead of swimming straight through them. The time I'd collected a piece of debris that had fallen from the platform and brought it to the surface instead of leaving it on the ocean floor. Moments when I'd shut off my welding torch to avoid disturbing a curious sea turtle. You show respect, the Watcher continued. You understand that you are a guest in my domain. I felt a strange warmth in the telepathic connection, something almost like gratitude. The creature had been watching me for months, studying my behavior, evaluating whether I deserved to live or die based on how I treated its territory. This is why you still breathe, it said. Others would have died on the first encounter. The grip around my waist loosened slightly, but the Watcher's black eyes remained fixed on mine. I could feel its ancient intelligence probing deeper into my thoughts, examining my memories of every dive I'd ever made, every interaction with marine life. You dispose of waste properly. You avoid unnecessary disturbance. You take only what the work requires and leave the rest untouched. I realized that every careful habit I'd developed over 5 years of diving, habits I'd thought were just good practice, had been keeping me alive. The Watcher had been testing me, watching to see if I was another threat to be eliminated, or someone who might be allowed to continue. But your presence is no longer acceptable. The Watcher's mental voice turned cold again. The damage from your kind grows worse each year. The platforms leak, the ships dump waste, the testing destroys breeding grounds. Images of environmental destruction flooded my mind again, recent damage that I recognized from platforms I'd worked on. Small leaks that management had deemed acceptable losses. Chemical dispersants used to break up oil spills that poisoned everything they touched. I cannot allow any human presence in these waters, the Watcher said. Even those who show respect must leave. The creature's grip tightened again, and I felt myself being pulled deeper. My depth gauge read 140 feet now, well beyond safe limits for the amount of air I had left. "This is your final warning," the Watcher continued. "You will not return to these waters. You will not dive in my territory again. If you do, the mercy I show you now will not be repeated." The telepathic connection intensified, and I felt the Watcher's absolute certainty that it could kill me instantly if it chose to. The creature had the power to crush my ribs, to tear my air hose, to drag me so deep that nitrogen narcosis would make me forget which way was up. "You have seen what I am capable of," it said. "You know that I am real, not the hallucination your doctors believe. You understand that I protect these waters from all threats." The Watcher's eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt it examining my deepest thoughts about the ocean, about my work, about the environmental damage I'd witnessed but never reported. "Leave this place," the Watcher commanded. "Find work on land, away from the waters I guard. Forget these depths exist." The creature began to release its grip, but the telepathic connection remained strong. I could feel its presence retreating from the deepest parts of my mind, but its final message came through with crystal clarity. "Remember that I am always watching. Remember that the ocean has a guardian who will not tolerate further destruction." The Watcher's massive form began to fade back into the darker water below, but its black eyes remained visible for several more seconds, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my chest tight. Then it was gone, disappearing into the depths as if it had never been there at all. I floated alone at 140 feet, my mind reeling from the telepathic encounter. My hands shook as I checked my air gauge. I had maybe 10 minutes left, barely enough to make a safe ascent. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me harder than the water pressure around my body. The Watcher was real. It had been eliminating divers for decades, and it had just given me the only warning I would ever receive. The pressure in my skull intensified as the Watcher's thoughts invaded deeper into my mind. I felt its alien consciousness probing through my memories, examining not just my diving history but my entire life. Images flashed through my head, my apartment, my family back in California, Robert and the crew on the platforms, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Rodriguez. The creature was cataloging everyone I knew, everyone I cared about. "These connections make you vulnerable," the Watcher's voice echoed in my thoughts. "Your defiance would bring consequences to others." I tried to push back against the mental intrusion, but the Watcher's presence was overwhelming. It showed me visions of what would happen if I ignored its warning. My younger sister Emma, working at her veterinary clinic in San Diego, completely unaware as something dark rose from the harbor waters. My parents in their retirement home near the coast, taking their evening walk along the beach they loved. Robert and the diving crew, going about their daily work on the platforms, never knowing that their association with me had marked them. "I protect these waters from all threats," the Watcher continued, its thoughts carrying images of decades of enforcement. "Those who defy my warnings learn that isolation offers no protection. The ocean touches all shores, reaches all harbors. Your people gather near water because they cannot resist its call." The creature's grip around my waist loosened slightly, but I could feel its power radiating through the water around us. My depth gauge read 145 feet now, and my air supply was getting dangerously low. The nitrogen narcosis should have been affecting me at this depth, but the Watcher's presence seemed to be keeping my mind unnaturally clear. "This is your final warning," the Watcher projected, and I felt the absolute certainty behind its words. "Leave these waters forever. Find work far from any coast. Speak of this encounter to no one. If you return, if you bring others, If you attempt to expose my existence, the consequences will extend beyond yourself. The images in my mind shifted to show the Watcher's long history of eliminating threats. Divers who had pushed too far, researchers who had gotten too close to understanding, entire crews who had witnessed things they shouldn't have. But now I saw something new. The creature's ability to track people far from the ocean, to reach them through any body of water connected to its domain. Your family swims in pools fed by coastal aquifers, it showed me. Your friends vacation at lakes that flow to the sea. Water connects all things, and I am the guardian of all water that knows the ocean's touch. My air gauge was flashing red now, less than 5 minutes remaining. The Watcher sensed my growing panic about the ascent, and slowly began to release its hold on me. Go, it commanded. Rise to your surface world and never return. Remember that I am always watching, always waiting. The ocean has a long memory, and I am its keeper. The creature's form began to fade, its solid presence becoming translucent as it retreated into the darker depths below. But the telepathic connection remained strong for several more seconds, burning its final message into my consciousness. Protect those you love by staying away. Then the Watcher was gone, vanishing into the black water beneath me like it had never existed. But the pressure in my skull remained, and I knew that some part of its presence would always be with me now. I was alone at 145 feet, with barely 4 minutes of air left. I activated my emergency ascent system immediately, feeling the buoyancy compensator inflate and pull me upward. Every instinct screamed at me to rocket to the surface, but my training held. I forced myself to ascend at the proper rate, watching my depth gauge count down. 130 feet, 120, 110. The safety protocols that had been drilled into me for years were the only thing keeping me from a fatal case of decompression sickness. At 15 feet, I forced myself to stop for the mandatory safety stop, even though my air gauge was now deep in the red zone. 3 minutes felt like an eternity. As I hung there in the water, my mind reeling from everything the Watcher had shown me, the creature's threats against my family echoed in my thoughts, and I knew with absolute certainty that it had the power to carry them out. When I finally broke the surface, I was gasping and shaking uncontrollably. The platform deck seemed impossibly far above me, and I could barely manage to grab the dive ladder when Robert lowered it. My hands were trembling so badly I could hardly grip the rungs. "Marcus, what the hell happened down there?" Robert's voice sounded distant and muffled, like he was speaking through water. "You've been down for over an hour. We were about to send someone after you." I couldn't answer. My entire body was shaking as Robert and 2 other crew members hauled me up onto the deck. Someone pulled my mask off, and I found myself staring up at concerned faces, but I couldn't focus on any of them. The Watcher's final images were still burning in my mind. My sister, my parents, everyone I cared about marked for death if I didn't comply. "Get him out of that gear," Robert was saying to someone. "Marcus, talk to me. Are you hurt? Did you get bent?" I managed to shake my head, but I still couldn't speak. My wetsuit felt like it was crushing me, and I clawed at the zipper with numb fingers. One of the crew members helped me get it down, and the cool air hit my skin like a shock. "I'm done," I finally managed to whisper. "What?" Robert knelt down beside me. "Marcus, you're in shock. Let's get you to the medical bay and—" "I'm done," I said louder, my voice cracking. "I quit. I'm never going back down there." Robert's face went pale. "Marcus, you need to calm down. Whatever happened down there, we can work through it." Dr. Rodriguez said, "No." I struggled to sit up, pushing away the hands that tried to steady me. I'm quitting. Today. Right now. I want my final paycheck and I'm leaving. You can't just quit like this, Robert said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. You're the best diver we have. Take some time off, get back into therapy. Let the medication work. I said no. The words came out as a shout, and everyone on the deck took a step back. I could see the fear in their eyes, the way they were looking at me like I'd completely lost my mind. Maybe I had. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky but holding my weight. I need my gear bag and my final pay. I'm leaving today. Robert ran his hands through his hair, clearly struggling with what to say. Marcus, please. Just think about this for a minute. You've been diving for 5 years. This is your career, your life. Don't throw it all away because of some bad experiences. It's not up for discussion, I said, my voice steadier now. The decision felt final, carved in stone. The watcher's warning echoed in my mind, and I knew I had no choice. I'm done with diving. I'm done with the ocean. I'm finding work on land. What am I supposed to tell the company? Robert asked. They're going to want to know why you're leaving so suddenly. I looked at him, this man who had been my supervisor and friend for years, and realized I could never tell him the truth. No one would believe that an ancient guardian lived in the depths, that it had threatened my family, that it had the power to reach anyone connected to the ocean's waters. Tell them I had a breakdown, I said quietly. Tell them the pressure got to me and I couldn't handle it anymore. Tell them whatever you want, but I'm not changing my mind. Robert stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. If that's really what you want, I'll process your paperwork and have your final check ready in an hour. I spent that hour in the break room, sitting alone at the metal table where I'd shared so many meals with the crew. My diving gear was piled in the corner, the wetsuit, the weight belt, the regulator that had kept me alive through hundreds of dives. Looking at it now, I felt nothing but revulsion. When Robert returned with my check and termination papers, I signed everything without reading it. The amount didn't matter. Nothing mattered except getting as far away from the ocean as possible. Where will you go? Robert asked as I gathered my personal belongings into a small bag. Inland, I said. Somewhere far from any coast. Maybe Colorado or Arizona. Somewhere dry. Robert nodded, though I could see he still didn't understand. Well, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find us. The job will always be here. I almost laughed at that. The job would be here, but I would never be back. The watcher had made sure of that. I walked to the edge of the platform one last time, looking down at the water that had been my workplace for 5 years. Somewhere in those depths, the watcher was waiting and watching. I could feel its presence like a weight in my chest, a constant reminder of the choice I'd been forced to make. The boat that would take me back to shore was already waiting at the dock below. I shouldered my bag and headed for the ladder, not looking back at the crew or the equipment or the life I was leaving behind. As the boat pulled away from platform 11, I sat in the stern and watched the structure grow smaller in the distance. The water around us was calm and blue, looking deceptively peaceful in the afternoon sun. But I knew what lurked beneath that surface, what ancient intelligence watched from the depths. I pulled out my phone and started searching for jobs inland. Construction work, building inspection, anything that would keep me far from large bodies of water. The watcher had given me a choice, and I was making it. My family would be safe, my friends would be protected, and I would carry the secret of the ocean's guardian for the rest of my life. The platform disappeared behind us as we headed for shore, and I knew I would never see it again. I quit diving on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and by Friday I was already looking at construction jobs 300 miles inland. The decision felt like ripping off a bandage, quick, painful, but necessary. I couldn't stay near the water anymore. Not after what the Watcher had shown me. Not after feeling its presence invade every corner of my mind. The first job I found was with a company called Desert Ridge Construction in Phoenix, Arizona. About as far from the ocean as I could get without leaving the country. When the foreman, a guy named Austin Lloyd, asked why I was switching from underwater welding to regular construction, I told him I wanted a change of pace. He didn't push for details, just looked at my welding certifications and hired me on the spot. "You'll be supervising the steel crew on a new office complex," he said, handing me a hard hat and safety vest. "Pay's decent, and we've got steady work for the next 2 years." I nodded and signed the paperwork, trying not to think about how much less I'd be making compared to my diving salary. Money didn't matter anymore. What mattered was staying alive and keeping the Watcher's threats away from everyone I cared about. The work was straightforward, overseeing welders and ironworkers as they assembled the building's frame. I knew steel, knew welding, and the crew respected my experience even if they didn't know where it came from. But every night when I got back to my small apartment, the memories would surface. I'd close my eyes and see those black, unblinking eyes staring at me from the depths. I'd feel the pressure in my skull as the Watcher's alien thoughts invaded my mind, showing me images of my family, my friends, everyone I'd ever cared about. The creature's final warning echoed constantly. "You will not return to these waters. Any future encounters will not be met with mercy." Sleep became a battle. I'd lie in bed, exhausted from 10 hours of construction work. But the moment I drifted off, I was back underwater at 140 feet, feeling those appendages wrap around my waist. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, checking my phone to make sure I was still in Arizona, still hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. 3 months into the job, Robert called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Marcus, how are you doing out there?" His voice sounded tired, older somehow. "I'm fine," I said, standing on the balcony of my apartment, looking out at the desert landscape. No water in sight. "How's the crew?" "Missing you. We've got a new guy, but he's not half the diver you were." Robert paused. "Listen, I know you said you were done, but if you ever want to come back, the job's here. Whatever happened on that last dive, we can work through it." I gripped the phone tighter, feeling the Watcher's presence like a weight in my chest. Even talking about diving brought back the memory of those alien thoughts probing through my mind, examining every person I'd ever known. "I'm not coming back, Robert. I told you I'm done with diving. But why? You were the best we had. Dr. Rodriguez thinks with the right treatment..." "No." The word came out harsher than I intended. "I'm staying here. I've got a good job, good crew. This is where I belong now." Robert was quiet for a long moment. "All right, Marcus. But if you change your mind, I won't." After I hung up, I stood on the balcony for an hour, watching the sun set over the mountains. No ocean horizon, no platforms, no depths hiding ancient guardians. Just dry land stretching as far as I could see. The construction project kept me busy during the day, but the nights were still difficult. I started avoiding swimming pools, even the small one at my apartment complex. The sight of that much water, even chlorinated and shallow, made my skin crawl. I'd remember the Watcher's words about the ocean connecting all shores, about its ability to track anyone through any body of water. 6 months after leaving the Gulf, I was promoted to senior supervisor. Austin Lloyd pulled me aside after a particularly successful week. You've got good instincts, Marcus. The crew trusts you, and you know your stuff. How'd you like to take on the next project? It's a big one. New hospital complex, 18 months of work. I accepted without hesitation. 18 more months of steady work, 18 more months away from the water. The hospital project would keep me busy, keep my mind occupied with steel beams and concrete foundations instead of black eyes and alien thoughts. But even as I threw myself into the work, supervising crews of 20 or 30 workers, coordinating with architects and engineers, the Watcher's presence never fully left me. Sometimes, in quiet moments between tasks, I'd feel that familiar pressure in my skull, as if something was probing at the edges of my consciousness. I'd shake my head, focus on the blueprints in front of me, remind myself that I was hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The crew started calling me Desert Marcus, because I'd been in Phoenix longer than anyone expected. They joked that I must really hate water, since I never even went to the community pool or took weekend trips to the lakes up north. If they only knew how right they were. One evening, about 8 months after leaving the Gulf, I was reviewing the next day's work schedule when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister Emma in California. She was planning a beach vacation and wanted to know if I'd join the family for a week in San Diego. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before typing back, "Can't make it. Work's too busy." She called immediately. "Come on, Marcus. You've been working non-stop. When's the last time you took a vacation?" "I'm fine here, Emma, really. But it's the ocean. I thought you loved the water." The words hit me like a physical blow. I love the water, past tense. I used to love diving. Used to feel at home beneath the waves. Now the thought of standing on a beach, looking out at the endless blue, made my hands shake. "I'm just not interested anymore," I said. "Since when? You used to talk about diving all the time. What happened?" I couldn't tell her, couldn't explain that something ancient and powerful lived in those depths, something that had marked me and everyone I cared about. Couldn't describe the telepathic invasion, the alien thoughts, the warning that still echoed in my mind every night. "I changed careers, Emma. I'm focused on construction now." She didn't push, but I could hear the confusion in her voice when she said goodbye. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, looking at photos on my phone from my diving days. Pictures of me in my wetsuit, grinning next to Robert and the crew. Images of platforms and equipment, the tools of a trade I'd never practice again. I deleted them all. The hospital project wrapped up ahead of schedule, and Austin offered me a permanent position as project manager. The pay was good, the work was steady, and Phoenix felt like home now. I'd built a life here, far from the water, far from the Watcher's domain. But late at night, when the desert was quiet and the city lights dimmed, I could still feel those black eyes watching me. Not physically. I was too far inland for that. But the memory of that final encounter remained vivid. The creature's massive form, its appendages wrapped around my waist, the overwhelming presence that had invaded my thoughts and shown me exactly how powerless I was. I'd made the right choice leaving. The Watcher had given me a warning, not a death sentence, and I'd heeded it. I'd found work on land, stayed away from large bodies of water, kept my family safe by keeping my distance from the ocean. But the knowledge of what lurked in those depths, what ancient guardian protected the seas with lethal efficiency, would stay with me forever. Sometimes I wondered about the other divers, the ones still working the platforms. Did they ever see the Watcher? Did they feel its presence during their dives? Or was I the only one it had chosen to spare, the only one who'd been given a chance to walk away? I never found out. I never called Robert again, never checked in with the crew, never looked up news about diving accidents in the Gulf. That part of my life was over, sealed away like a compartment in a damaged submarine. I was a construction supervisor now, a man who worked with steel and concrete, who kept his feet firmly planted on dry ground. The Watcher had won. It had driven me from its territory, forced me to abandon everything I'd known and loved about the ocean. But in return, it had let me live. It had spared my family, my friends, everyone I cared about. The trade seemed fair, even if the cost was higher than I'd ever imagined. I settled into my new life, supervising construction crews under the Arizona sun, building structures that would stand for decades on solid ground. But every night, when I closed my eyes, I was back in those depths, feeling the weight of an ancient presence that had judged me and found me worthy of mercy. The Watcher's black eyes remained fixed in my memory, a constant reminder that some guardians were older and more powerful than any human understanding, and that the ocean's depths held secrets that were better left undisturbed.